So just to review, in the previous tutorials we have applied a rusty texture to our water tower here, and once that was finished we went ahead and added some weld lines. I went ahead and added a second cylinder of a smaller diameter on top of the bowl, and on top of that I put a styrofoam ball that has been distressed and sealed so that it won't react with the spray paint that we're going to be applying to this piece. I'll go ahead and make a tutorial in the future to go over exactly how to seal the styrofoam and how to distress it. But for the purpose of this tutorial we'll just stick with how to paint the rust effects on the piece. Once you're ready to prime your piece, the primer that I prefer using is the Rust-Oleum Rust Colored Primer, and this is from their Professional series. It has excellent coverage and the color is perfect for the acrylic paints we're going to use for the rust effects. So I've added some ground cover to the piece here over the pink foam and a couple of wooden posts and fence beams, and that'll be used to hold some armor and create a defensive line. I also temporarily glued on the small decks that will form the spiral staircase that goes around the perimeter of the piece. This will lead up to a larger deck and then probably a ladder that will reach up towards the spherical section at the top of the piece. So this is what the terrain piece is going to look like once you get the rust effects painted on there. So at this point the paint has been added and there's also been a wash that has been applied to it, and this really makes that rust texture pop. So let's go ahead and get started. Paints we'll be using for the rust effects are all from Americana, the first of which is Heritage Brick. We're going to follow that by a layer of Burnt Sienna, and that will be followed by Raw Sienna, then a layer of Honey Brown paint will be added, and if you choose as an option you can do a layer of silver metallic gunmetal gray and then a lamp black to add the shadows. We won't be doing that on this piece. Instead we're going to apply a series of washes since we have a lot of great texture to deal with, and that's where we're going to draw our shadows from. So the first layer that we're going to apply here is the Heritage Brick, and you'll notice that I'm using the drywall sponge or the tile sponge since it has the larger cell openings and you can apply the paint very fast. When you apply the Heritage Brick color you can be fairly generous since what we're trying to do is just break up that base color that the spray paint has laid down for us. Since what we're doing is just really trying to break up that solid color of spray paint, once this dries you're not going to see a huge difference. It's going to be very subtle, but once we add the subsequent layers that are a lighter color, this really will make a difference. At this point we're not too worried about larger splotches that might have been laid down with this color. We've got several layers that are going to be on top of this, so you can apply this fairly quickly and it's a fairly forgiving step. So now let's move on to the next color. We're going to go ahead and apply the Burnt Sienna to the piece now. Again we're going to use the same drywall sponge with the larger cell openings, but now you have to start to pay attention a little bit to where you apply it. The weld lines are going to pick up the paint very fast, so if you're not careful the color of the weld lines will be predominantly the Burnt Sienna and it just won't quite look right. So I will almost go through and just apply the paint to each panel individually and then go through and touch up the weld lines to make sure they match the rest of the terrain piece. But again, this step isn't too tricky, you can accomplish this quite quickly. Just pay attention to those weld lines. So as you can see, even though this is only the second color that we've added, it's really starting to get some depth to the piece and those higher sections are starting to come out. And you've almost got some highlighting in addition to the contrast between the Heritage Brick layer and the foundation of primer paint. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to apply the layer of Raw Sienna. The important thing to realize here is that the Raw Sienna is almost a tan type color, and it's the first of what I would call the highlight layer for the piece. So we're going to switch to the dishwashing sponge here since it has a little bit finer texture, and we will not be using nearly as much paint on the sponge as we have on the previous steps. So what I'll do is just go through and you're you're going to mostly focus on the raised sections of the rusty texture that you've already added, and then go through and pick up some of those raised edges on the weld lines that you have on here. Take your time a little bit with this one, whereas if you make a stamped type motion, or if you smear the paint or it goes on too heavy, you've got quite a bit of time invested in the piece at this point. So I'll almost keep a paper towel nearby and wipe the excess paint on the sponge onto a paper towel. If you do happen to apply the paint very heavy in a certain location, don't worry too much. You're going to be able to fix that when you do the chipped paint effect. The method I use does not involve hairspray, and you're going to be able to control exactly what areas of the terrain piece are heavily chipped and what areas of the terrain piece have no chipping whatsoever. So all you have to do is, when you have the mistake happen, is make sure that the chipped paint doesn't come off over the mistake, and it will be covered up for the future. At this point, the terrain piece is really going to start looking good. All those little highlights will really bring out the rust texture that you've applied and those weld lines, and all your hard work will really start to shine through now. So now we'll move on to our final layer for the rust effect, and that is a very light highlight using the honey brown. And again, you're going to use the kitchen or the dishwashing sponge to do this. When you apply this, it's very little paint that you're going to put on the piece. This is like the final highlight of the miniature or the terrain piece here, so be very conservative as you apply this, and apply it to just the very highest portions of the rust texture and on the limited locations along your rusted weld lines. So now you have finished applying the paint for the rust effects, and if it was a flat panel at this point, you could go ahead and add the black and the silver with the blister foam. But since this is a highly textured piece, we're going to save some time and go with a wash that will bring out all those little shadows. In the next part of this tutorial, I will share the recipe that I use for my wash for my terrain and some of the techniques and pitfalls that can be encountered when applying the wash. So be sure to subscribe, and thanks for watching.